Okay, welcome. We are going to be looking at chapter 4 this week. And last week we looked at animals. That was chapter 3. This week we're looking at plants. And I'm trying this new way of teaching. Instead of doing notes and PowerPoints, I'm going to make this video and I'm going to rely on you guys to make your own notes. It's good practice to do that. Maybe next week we'll go back to our previous way of doing things, or maybe we'll try something even newer. We'll see how that goes. Like I said, this is 4.1. We're learning about systems in plants. And just like we did for animals, we are going to be looking at the hierarchy or the structural organization for plants first. So just like animals, plants are broken down into smaller components. So if you recall from when we learned about animals, animals were made up of organ systems, which were made up of organs, which were made up of tissues and then cells. Plants are similar. I'm going to write it down in the same way that we did for animals, but it's a little bit different, and I'll talk about those differences in a bit. So just like we did for animals, plants can be broken down into organ systems, and I've put a quotation, or I'm going to put a quotation around the word organ just because it's not quite the same between a plant and animal. And every time I mention organ in this lesson, you still have to sort of think about it that way, right? They're not the same as animal organs. Organs are made up of tissues, and then tissues are made up of cells. So when you think about a plant, right, you might realize or already understand that they are multicellular organisms. They're made up of more than one cell. However, they're not quite as complex as us. We have so many different systems in place. Plants don't have that, but they are still living things, and they still have to do the few main things that living things do. So precisely, they have to grow, they have to reproduce, and they have to do gas exchange. Those are things that both plants and animals have in common. And you'll see that I attempted in drawing a little flower on that plant just to show you that in this specific lesson, we're only going to be talking about flowering plants. There are a variety of different plants out there that don't all work the same way, but this covers a general understanding, or this covers most of the points of a average plant, if you will. If you're looking at organ systems, you can separate the plant into two main parts. So you've got above the ground, which is what we call a shoot system. I will write that down. And then below the ground, we have our root system. So shoot system, root system, you can see why that doesn't necessarily look to you like an organ system, like the digestive system or the circulatory system, but it's a good level of organization for us. And further, the shoot system can be separated into leaves, stems, or flowers. Okay, and leaf stems and flowers are the main components of shoot systems, and they allow for the plant to do most of its functions, including the ones that I mentioned earlier. Let's look at leaves in a little bit more detail. So you probably already know that leaves are green, or most leaves are green. And they are green because they are made up of a certain organelle that only plant cells have. You might remember that, you might not. These organelles allow for the leaves to do the process of photosynthesis. So this is the process by which leaves are able to take carbon dioxide and water and sunlight and make energy for themselves. And when we eat those leaves, we get that same energy as well. Now we're thinking back to some chemistry. We're going to write the chemical reaction for photosynthesis. So you have carbon dioxide plus water. You've got an arrow with the word light over it. That just tells you that there needs to be light for this process to happen. And then C6H12O6, that's glucose, plus O2, which is oxygen. Another way that I can represent this is to write the word equation. So that's the exact same thing that I just did, but now I'm actually writing out the names of each of those chemicals. So carbon dioxide plus water. That arrow with the word light over it tells you that this process can only happen in the presence of light. And it produces glucose, which is the energy, plus oxygen as well. You can't see the rest of that, but it's still there. So those are two ways that I can represent photosynthesis. And if I look into a leaf under a microscope, I might be able to identify some of the plant cells or the leaf cells that I see. And one of those things, as I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons that plants are different from animals is because they contain an organelle, and that organelle is called the chloroplast. And the chloroplast is where photosynthesis takes place. It is also the reason why leaves are green. So chloroplast has chlorophyll in them, which is what makes those leaves green. And why is it green? Because it needs to do photosynthesis. Also, chlorophyll is spelt with 2 L's at the end, but that's fine. So if I were to open up a chloroplast, I will notice a bunch of these stacks over there. So there are a bunch of discs stacked up on top of each other. And that entire disc, or one of those stacks, is what we call a grana. So what it does, or each of those discs are able to do photosynthesis. So there's a bunch of them, a stack of them, which allows for more photosynthesis to take place. So that entire stack is called grana, and each of those discs is called thylakoid. I'm going to try that again because there's not enough room. There we go. Okay, so plant cells have chloroplasts. That's where photosynthesis takes place. Okay, going back to our shoot system, we're now going to be looking at flowers. Oh, looks like I forgot how to spell flowers. We're going to be looking at flowers and how they help the plant do its functions. Now, what most people might not realize about flowers is that flowers aid with reproduction when it comes to plants. Depending on the type of plant, depending on the type of flower, it works in a different way, but we'll look at that in a bit. So flowers allow for the plant to reproduce. There's a few different possibilities of the structure of flowers. So flowers can have a male part, a female part, or it can have both. And when I'm referring to these parts, they are just little stems or little parts of the flower that allow for the plant to reproduce. So specifically within the male part produces what we know as pollen grains. And if you have allergies or seasonal allergies, this is what you're allergic to. There's a lot of pollen flying throughout the air. We'll see why that is in just a bit. But the pollen is produced by the male component of the flower. The female part of the component of the flower produces eggs. Now, these aren't the eggs that you have for breakfast. They're just small little areas that have to come into contact with the pollen grains in order to produce or reproduce. Now, when these come together, they produce seeds, right? And reproduction, that makes sense because if you were to plant a seed into the ground, any seed, you will create more of that plant, right? So that is the whole process of reproduction. And what are those seeds usually found in? There are fruits that grow around those seeds so as to encourage, an animal, if they were to eat that fruit and then they don't digest that seed, it's going to be scattered to different areas, which means that plant is able to reproduce, right? So those seeds or the fruit grow around those seeds. The process in which the pollen and the eggs come together is called pollination. And pollination can happen in a few ways. So, as I mentioned earlier, if you have allergies, it's because there's a lot of pollen in the air. And what's happening is that pollen is being released by the male part of certain flowers, and it's moving throughout the air to try and come into contact with a female part of another flower. So wind is a huge part in order for pollination to occur. And another thing that contributes to pollination is animals, or specifically insects, right? So if there is a certain part of that particular plant that's appealing to that insect, if it goes near the flower, or if it comes into contact with the pollen, it maybe sticks to that insect. And when that insect goes to a different plant, it can maybe drop off that pollen, and then it can come in contact with the eggs, right? So those are two ways in which pollination usually takes place. So going back to our whole organization, we've got a third component of the shoot system, which is stems. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about stems because the structure of stems and the function of stems vary within the different types of plant. So we'll look at a few examples later, but for now, we're just going to know that stems are part of the shoot system, and that's about it. Moving on to tissues, there are 3 types of tissues. There are dermal tissue, which refers to tissue on the outside of the plant. Then we have vascular tissue. This is tissue inside of the plant, usually helps with transportation. And the third type of tissue is ground tissue, which is any tissue that's not the other two. That's not the dermal tissue or the vascular tissue. And that's pretty much the overall structure of plants, at least to the extent that we're going to be looking at. The homework on page 128, do questions 1 to 3. And that's it.